Hi everyone, my name is Amedero Pugliese and I'm professor of accounting at the Department of Economics and Management at the University of Padova. And I'm truly delighted to share with you some of our findings related to a recently accepted paper on the Journal of Accounting and Public Policy, which is titled Covid-19, Corporate Survival and Public Policy, the Role of Accounting Information and Regulation in the Wake of a Systemic Crisis. The work is co-authored with Bruno Buchetti and Antonio Parbonetti, who are colleagues at the Department of Economics and Management. And importantly, the project was fully funded through a COVID-19 research grant scheme proposed and awarded by the University of Padova in the aftermath of the crisis. Just to kick off our presentation here, what is the context and the trigger? As the title was indicating, the study is about the COVID-19 and the effects of COVID and release mechanisms implemented by the Italian government on corporations. So it all started late March 2020, when everyone was in lockdown, and we started realizing that not surprisingly, firms suffered significant economic losses due to the collapse of revenues because of the generalized lockdown that was actually preventing people to move around and even firms to continue with their production. Nearly immediately after the COVID outbreak, governments started injecting a huge amount of resources to help both firms and employees. At the time, what we realized is that the main focus of governments, not only the Italian one, was primarily on ensuring corporate liquidity so that actually firms could continue in their operations to avoid what we call a contagion effect. At the same time, there was less attention to long-term solvency and bankruptcy risk of firms because at the time, firms were allowed to replace revenues that they were losing with debt. And this is, of course, creating a concern because the risk is that firms may be over-leveraged if they took on too much debt on board. So we basically kicked off our research by focusing on how accounting information and regulation can actually help policymakers and governments in the aftermath of a systemic crisis. Now, one thing that is pretty well known by the general public and the regulators and policymakers is that upon the occurrence of a systemic crisis, there is usually a pretty fast and timely response of governments. And what is controversial is how to define and design interventions that can be effective in helping firms and workers, and at the same time that are not overburdening public finances and taxpayers. So we set out with three key objectives for this study. The first one was estimating the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on Italian corporations. Then, secondly, quantifying the effects of relief mechanisms in rescuing firms. And third, we performed the cost-benefit analysis of alternative and viable mechanisms that the Italian government could have designed vis-a-vis the current ones. So what we did was performing a very granular analysis on about 600,000 Italian firms for which financial statement information was available at the end of 2019, just prior to the inception of the crisis. So we have basically three main findings here. The first one is related to the effects of COVID and relief mechanisms on corporate bankruptcies. Now, corporate bankruptcies are crucial in the post-crisis period because actually there is a high risk that a substantial part of the Italian productive system or even entire industries may collapse. So what we notice here, we have on the slide as well, we can see that the number of distressed firms absent prior to the crisis is in the range of 10 to 11% of the universe of firms. This is what we call a physiology. So this is what we call the mortality of firms in a steady state. Now, when the financial crisis due to COVID kicks in, we see that absent interventions of the state, this number would nearly triple. With about 25% of the universe of Italian companies that may actually face bankruptcy. And then what happens is that with all the interventions suggested and prompted by the Italian government, this number drops significantly from 153,000 to about 110,000. Same goes when we look at the employees at risk, because collapsing firms means higher unemployment and job losses. Here the figures are quite dramatic. Because the number of employees at risk, absent government intervention, would go from 230,000 before COVID to nearly 1.4 million. And this is basically a major concern, also explaining why the government intervened with the Cassa Integrazione Guadagni, which is a furlough measure. Then, when we take into account all the mechanisms put forward by the government, this number drops to about 2/3, which is a significant recovery from our standpoint. Similarly, we looked at what happens in terms of the exposure towards the financial system, because all these companies also have debt and credit positions toward banks. And here we can see that actually the number of loans at risk nears 68 billions, which is about 1/2 of what happened during the financial crisis in 2014-2015. And again, when we take into account government interventions, the number drops of about 2/3 to 48 billion. So that speaks altogether to say that actually the government intervention was somehow relevant and effective in mitigating the effects of the pandemic. Then we have a second set of results when we look at how the different types of interventions may have helped rescuing firms and employees. And we take into account 4 major interventions. The first one is the furlough, which is the Cassa Integrazione Guadagni, that helps both firms and workers. The second one is a contribution one-off to replace missing revenues and to help firms in paying off costs for rentals and leases that are actually really hard to renegotiate in the short run. And the fourth one is an accounting-only measure that is basically allowed companies to suspend and postpone amortization, so that actually the effect on profitability and income statement would be much tempered. When we take all of the 4 mechanisms into account, we can see on the graph on the right-hand side of the slide that actually the most costly intervention is related to the furlough. And this is in the range of 32 billions. And these forecasts are actually quite in line with the data from the National Security Organization, which gives us a ballpark figure of 33 billion. So that gives us reassurance that actually our estimations are pretty robust. Secondly, the contribution towards revenues and rentals are much lower, in the range of 3 billion each, whereas the amortization, that is basically postponing the non-financial cost of firms, it's in the range of 11 billion, primarily due to the tax levies that actually accrue to firms. Overall, all the 4 mechanisms costed about 49 billions, and they saved altogether nearly 43,000 firms. So we move to the third type of finding, in which we basically try to answer the following question. Are there any alternative mechanisms that can be put forward by the government? And we found 2 viable alternatives. The first one would be helping firms with a one-off contribution in terms of equity or in terms of one-off revenue that would actually allow firms facing bankruptcy to avoid it. So basically, this mechanism would save all firms facing potential bankruptcy, and this would cost about 40 billion. So this is slightly less than the current cost that we saw before in the previous slide neared 49 billion. The second option would entail replenishing all losses incurred by all firms because of COVID. Like, imagine you can wipe out the COVID effect. Of course, I mean, no surprise, this intervention would be much more costly and broader and would total 93 billions. But still, 93 billions is much less than the money that are coming through the Next Generation EU package that the European Union has agreed with the Italian government. Altogether, we believe this study is relevant for the society and policymakers for three main reasons. First, we brought forward a methodological contribution that can be actually useful to policymakers. We offer a very micro and granular approach for governments to assess ex ante the costs and benefits of alternative policies if a crisis hit. Secondly, we compare the effectiveness of alternative measures used by nearly all governments in Europe. So this is not just something that we see in Italy, but all these measures have been produced by virtually all governments. And third, in this study, we highlight a risk that is oftentimes underestimated, which is the risk of modifying accounting rules without a careful assessment. Altogether, this is basically what we show in our study, and we hope that it actually gets traction both in the scientific community and in practice. Thank you very much, all.